Good evening. Welcome to our show. Let me introduce Dr.
Sherry Conrad on my right and Dr. Michael Millburn on my left, both professors at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I might add, professors in one of my favorite subjects in the whole world, psychology. I also love philosophy, just for the record, but we're here tonight with psychology, and as many of you know, those two merge quite often and quite well. Last time that these doctors were with me, they had talked quite a bit about the relation between how one is brought up in terms of severity of punishment, harshness of punishment, and corporal punishment as a child and a young person, and its relation to how one might hold views on public policy such as the death penalty, abortion, a military force, and so on. The idea being, they said they found in their research and in a book they've written about it, the idea being that the harsher the punishment or harsh punishment in the beginning seems to be quite correlated with one holding very harsh views on matters of giving people the penalty of death or using strong force militarily, etc. So I thought, in the aftermath of our discussion last time, that we would continue more broadly and more fundamentally this time on the idea of what we really are talking about when we speak psychologically, in dynamic terms, in terms that people are a product of their early experience, that there's more to what we're doing than meets the eye, that there's things we aren't aware of about ourselves that are very real and very happening moment to moment as we live. We're not just living at our computers in a sort of unidimensional time and space. We are deeper creatures. We are creatures of a lot of motive, emotion, drive, motivation, meaning, symbolic representation, dimensions that are intricate and sometimes take more than a lifetime to learn about our own selves as points in case. But today we'll begin with talking about where this whole dynamic kind of principle and meaning and substance of the psyche and the psychology of life is pegged to have begun, namely with Sigmund Freud back in Vienna in the last, well, I can't say last century, in fact, the century before last. And then it was known as psychoanalytic theory and has since evolved into something called dynamic theory. And I think I'll start by asking Dr. Conrad, what does the word dynamic mean? What should we take from that word dynamic? Or maybe you even want to go back and say why it was called psychoanalytic if you choose, but certainly that word dynamic.
Well, that's a great question, Nancy. I think the term dynamic refers to the fact that there are processes going on internally, psychologically, that are linked, that occur in a logical fashion, a psychological fashion, that we're not necessarily consciously aware of, but that produce predictable results in behavior, in beliefs, and so on. So the defense mechanisms are a good example of one of the dynamic aspects of Freud's theory.
How about the notion that the theory is dynamic also in the sense that there's a lot more going on than just a one-to-one representation of what's right in front of us? Would that be a meaning to the dynamic aspect of it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. I mean, Freud talked about various levels of consciousness, and it's become somewhat reified over time, but he pointed out that sometimes there's material that is not in our mind at the moment, your best friend's telephone number, but if I mention that, it comes into awareness very readily. But then there's other material that we're not aware of, and that it's very difficult to gain access to. But the mental content is there, and it does influence our behavior.
I think that's a great phrase again now, that you say, content that is in our mind or our soul or our substance inside of us. And that's just a metaphorical way of talking because we can't go inside and find it. But it's with us, and it's having an impact on us. And even something like someone else's telephone number is sort of a neutral. It depends. If that's a boyfriend that you're trying to get a hold of that you're having a problem with, that you feel is cheating on you, that number might have some affective, and affect here means emotional. Just saying the number, if we were to put you on a galvanometer, we might see the meter go into danger, red territory, because of the emotions that it causes in you. But let's say generally a number is sort of a neutral thing, as is a lot of information in this information processing world. There's a lot of neutral, but great amounts of neutral, non-semantically, non-symbolically represented, not meaningful data that we have to contend with, which is a whole other story that's burdening our psyche and our cognitive and storage capacity, if you will. But that's a whole other story. But the thing that there's things in you that are simultaneously there that are painful or hopeful or put you in one kind of mood or another or mean something to you beyond just a telephone number, like your life's experiences. Do you have something to say to that, maybe?
Specifically...
that you have things inside of you that are simultaneously part of you at any moment in time, even if that's not what's in your conscious mind at the moment. It's not what you're paying attention to, so to speak.
Well, certainly we carry around with us a great number of experiences and emotions associated with those experiences. Actually, a psychologist, John Bradshaw, who did a lot of work early in the 90s on the sort of inner child, made a sort of really very interesting sort of observation about that. He was really sort of concerned about, or curious about the Rambo movies, the Sylvester Stallone Rambo movies, and why they were so successful. And he watched them and watched them again and sort of realized what the whole process was, is that the movies are about a Vietnam vet who returns from the war. He's searching out a friend of his in this little town, can't find him. The people are saying, "Oh, go away." The cops tell him to get out of town. He keeps sort of poking around, and then finally the police arrest him, and they take him to the station house, and they strip him, and they beat him, and they humiliate him, and then he escapes, and because he's a special forces guy, he blows up the town. And Bradshaw sort of talking about how he realized what the process was, is so many people carry around with them experiences, not the same, but similar experiences that have similar meaning of humiliation or abuse. And they were able to sort of vicariously identify with Stallone's abuse and then retribution. Mm-hmm. And so the experiences that people carry around with them influence a variety of things, their behavior, but also the kinds of movies that appeal to them and get them excited.
So then that had meaning to them. It had relevancy that they could relate to. We use that word relate so
Absolutely.
much they could relate to. Now, what about the idea of identification? There was an example of identification. Mm-hmm. Could you say a little more about that, identification?
Well, in Freud's terms, it's a very early process, and it's the foundation of the whole moral sense that we develop. We identify, well, I shouldn't say we. Freud was talking about men. Men, little boys, identify with their fathers, and according to Freud, it was because they feared their fathers. And one way of dealing with the fear was to become just like Dad. If I'm like you, if I am you, then I'm safe. You won't hurt me if I'm a sort of shadow of you. And it's certainly true that little boys walk around with a tool belt, that they want to be like their fathers. Whether it's because they fear their fathers, as Freud said, I'm not so sure. But definitely they identify with their fathers. They model their behavior and their values. And I think girls do too. They model their behavior and their values on their mother's interests, sometimes their father's as well. And in adulthood, it's so powerful when someone in a movie or someone in real life or in a novel can behave in a way that expresses emotions that we may not even be aware that we have. I think, as Mike was saying, Rambo becomes so compelling to people, or whatever figure in a movie or in a novel, because of the vicariousness involved. You're able to vicariously enjoy Rambo doing what you could never do, which is something very violent and very extreme.
And striking back at the individuals who have beaten you and humiliated you, because children don't have that option typically.
Right, and that reminds me too when you say that Freud said it was based on fear. Of course, gender-wise, historically, out of common sense in a way, or just the lineage of human nature, human life, it has been sort of the women who would take the women and show the women how to be, and the men who would take the men and show the men how to be, because they looked and they said, well, morphologically or biologically, you know, you look like me, you have a different function, and you have, you know, it's been separated. And maybe that's going to change somewhat as we keep going into the future. But it brought, when you said about the idea that it's a fear-based concept that Freud had of why there was the introjection, shall we say, of father's values and father's ways and the identification, Freud has been known to base so much of what he was saying on the idea that people are driven by basic primordial urges, the word primordial, primitive urges, if you will, and the primitive urges are, in a nutshell, survival. The primitive urges are get food, get sex, get contact comfort, get pleasure, avoid pain. That about covers it. Very basic. He saw a lot of life in those terms, that at the very, would you say that there's a lot of truth to that if one goes to the very base level of human nature? No pun intended.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's some truth to it. Freud's emphasis on sexual impulses as the primary motivator of people's behavior. I think a lot of people since then have rejected that notion. I would. I think it's more complicated than that. If you look at small children, some of their primary needs seem to be not just for food and shelter and warmth, physical maintenance, if you will, but for human contact, just touching, and for responsiveness, to have someone respond to them when they're sad or when they're hungry, whatever it is. So I think one of the really interesting things that came after Freud was this additional insight that there are interpersonal needs that are as basic as the need for food. Children who are separated from a caretaker and never touched develop a terrible syndrome in which they lose weight, they don't develop appropriately. So touch can be as important as food in some ways.
Well, in fairness to Freud, I think really he probably would include touch. I doubt that he would say that you could just leave a child, you know, unattended. He certainly didn't bring up the whole issue of contact comfort. I think his idea of sexuality was much broader than fornication or adult sexuality. I think, and that's where we
certainly.
get it. Yeah.
Certainly.
So,
yeah,
and that's where we get into the three stages, the classic three stages: orality, anality, and sexuality. The phallic stage, what he called the phallic stage. You know, experiencing life and getting gratification in life through the mouth. Through defecatory, through elimination, and you know, the pleasure taken in evacuation, and the issues over control of that function, And finally, the burgeoning ideas of beyond just sensual pleasure and contact pleasure, but curiosity about genitalia and sex itself, like when little boys and girls say, where do babies come from? Or what are mommy and daddy doing in the bedroom, which they can think about very, very young in life. I suppose they could think about it the minute they can think today, because there's so much in the media showing them about this kind of aspect.
Although it's often at a fairly sort of naive level. We've been doing some research actually on sexuality and people's attitudes and behavior and beliefs about sexuality, and we actually asked about people's early experiences with sexuality, what they learned from their parents. And we had one research participant who she was about 9. She was recalling she was about 9, and her sister was about 7, and they were playing with their Barbie dolls, and they had picked up from watching the soap operas at their babysitter's house that men and women who were boyfriend and girlfriend sort of lie on top of one another. And so they were playing their Barbies, and they had Ken lying on top of Barbie. And their father walked in, and they had picked up, or she later really understood, that he had really very negative attitudes toward sexuality. And he walked in and just sort of blanched at what he had seen and didn't say anything at the moment, but subsequent to that, Ken was banned from the house. So that the father had really sort of projected onto his children that they understood a lot more about sexuality than they really did. They weren't actually imagining that Ken was having sexual intercourse with Barbie. They were just what they saw on TV, that the male would lie on top of the female in bed. And so, but children, of course, are sort of ever resourceful. Ken was banned from the house, but what they did was to take one of their Barbie dolls and cut the hair short on one of the Barbie dolls and have that Barbie doll lie on top of the other one.
Because you can always get around your parents, right?
Exactly.
But you know what? That's a good case in point for the dynamics of the situation. There's a telling case of dynamics, and before I ask you to take a stab at the dynamics there, back to that word dynamic, levels, but dynamic, the movingness of it, the simultaneity of all kinds of things in you at any moment in time, even if they're not in conscious experience, and some of them very profound indeed, and just a multiplicity making up what we call the personality and the psyche. But the idea too, coming from Freud, of forces, the hydraulic idea, the idea of the dynamicism of it being that some things are more forceful in your drive, in your motivation, in your I hate to use the word behavior because that's something that's really come over from behaviorism. I hate to use it. It's kind of a blanche word when we're talking this. But that idea, the forcefulness, some things having more valence than others, and some being so commanding and propelling throughout life that they become like the singular notable feature about a person.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Freud believed, or came to believe from his work with patients, that one of the most powerful forces in the human psyche was anxiety, because it served as a signal, a kind of an emergency alarm bell that particularly was a signal of a conflict between children's natural drives, whether it's curiosity about sex, whether it's children's natural aggression, sometimes anger, and the forces of polite, appropriate society. Children, as you said, are very clever, very resourceful, they're curious, and I think they're also very good at picking up on approval and disapproval. They know on some level that their questions about sexuality are not acceptable. Parents don't have to say anything. All they have to do is turn a certain color or get a certain facial expression, and children understand this is territory where mom and dad
or clam up
don't want me to go. Yes, yeah. So that conflict, that signal that there's mom and dad's approval and there's my curiosity or my impulses or my feelings, and there's conflict between the two, is one of the reasons why, according to Freud, children become unaware of their own feelings and their own impulses, whether it's sexual feelings or feelings of anger, and those feelings don't disappear. They, almost like a cork, are forever trying to bob up to the surface. It takes energy, and this is part of, I think, what you were saying, part of what a dynamic model means. It takes energy to keep things out of awareness. And when they get close to the surface, anxiety serves as the alarm. So anxiety is a very painful thing for a lot of people to experience. It's very difficult. And they'll do whatever they have to do to keep the anxiety at bay. And Freud draws us this model, very elaborate in some ways, but very elegant model, of the way in which people can pile one defense mechanism on top of another, almost as if there were an intruder knocking at the door, and you lock the door, and that doesn't look like it's going to hold, so you push heavy furniture against the door and then pile something on top of that. And I think you can see in people's behavior, and even catch in your own behavior at times, exactly what you're saying, the energy that's being expended to fuel a set of processes that have a certain order. First, I push something out of my mind. I think about it for a fleeting moment, and then I don't want to think about it. But if it comes back, I convince myself that I'm not angry at my best friend. I really feel very altruistically, or I'm not angry at my parents. I love them. And if that doesn't work, then there's another transformation and another. The term that Freud used that I love, vicissitudes, it just sounds nice, but also is a sense that it's almost endless, the processes that can be invoked, ending with neurotic symptoms to prevent anxiety. And that's always what's at the bottom of it.
In other words, too, you cannot hate your parents, even though we all do. I mean, you can, Freud said, the ambivalence, the conflict,
yes,
the anxiety, that the emotions are not pure. And the defense mechanisms get built up because there are things that you don't like that really rub you the wrong way. Some grossly so, and some, just commonly so. But almost, would he have said that it's almost a taboo historically? Would he have called it a taboo to be openly angry at your parents, no holds barred? Is that a taboo, or is that just a social repression, or?
Well, it's something that typically was forbidden for children. That disobedience, studies of sort of child-rearing manuals in Germany and I assume Austria at the time, for going back for hundreds of years, have indicated that one of the primary important things that the experts of the time said you needed to stamp out of children was any hint of disobedience. And anger toward the parents is showing disobedience toward the parents and defiance. And that had to be broken and crushed. You had to crush the will of the child in order to properly raise the child, was the belief. And so certainly expressing anger toward one's parents as a child was certainly forbidden. People go into adulthood and are often angry at their parents. But as a child, that typically is forbidden.
Do you think it was forbidden because Freud also wrote about how societies function and why things are structured the way they are, why they materialize as they do, why whole society itself represses, for the coherence and function of the order of things as it is, often on bases that are not very pretty too. Some of them back to his way of looking at life, much more primordially. But why would there be, utilitarian-wise, why would there be a drive or an urge in the culture at large to repress the children or repress their anger? Would it just cause chaos? Would it hinder the socioeconomic lineage and connectivity of things, or?
Well, actually, Alice Miller, in her book, For Your Own Good, Hidden Cruelties in Child Rearing and the Roots of Violence, and she was trained as a psychoanalyst, lives in Switzerland, and she talked about very much this process. Why do parents reinforce this and continue generation after generation this belief that children's will needed to be crushed, that defiance needed to be stopped? And what she said was that adults, having experienced that as childhood, are trying to reclaim the power they lost as children by enforcing their will upon their children. So it doesn't necessarily, Freud sort of spun these theories about how it was necessary for civilization to operate and so on.
Civilization and a discontent.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
But you don't actually have to weave a very complex theory like that. You can simply talk about how generation to generation to generation, the same pattern of behavior, the same way of interacting with one's children gets passed on, because the emotions, the negative emotions associated with that, the feelings of fear, of anger, of helplessness, get carried with a person from childhood into adulthood, and they end up displacing those feelings of anger and powerlessness and fearing those feelings and projecting that onto their children.
Yeah, there's this wonderful story in one of Alice Miller's subsequent books about a lovely tradition, what's considered a lovely tradition around Christmas time in Germany. The parents in a village take their children out on a beautiful sunny winter day near Christmas for a walk, just a stroll through the woods for exercise. And lo and behold, St. Nicholas appears, or Santa Claus, essentially. And St. Nicholas, of course, is an actor who's been hired by the parents. And the parents experience this as this magical encounter in the forest with St. Nicholas and go to great lengths to reproduce this tradition for their children. But what actually happens in that meeting with St. Nicholas is usually that he identifies each child by name and recounts to the child a list of the things that he or she has done wrong. Very specific, because of course the parents have provided the information. You know, you hit your little brother, you didn't help mommy pick up your toys, that sort of thing. And witnessing this one day, coming upon this in the woods, Alice Miller says the look on the children's faces was horror and terror. They were frightened. How does this man know about me? And there was an implicit threat. You need to help your mother more. You need to be more obedient. And it's not intended that way at all, but the parents themselves have had this outing and had this experience, which must have been, one assumes, frightening and horrifying for them as children. And the fact that they go to such great lengths to reproduce it suggests that they've forgotten all about the fear, the horror, the humiliation even, because they are singled out in front of their peers and their sins are read off. And they now see it as this lovely Christmas outing, and they don't understand what they're doing to their own children. That's where denial comes in, I think. Would you agree?
But you know what I'm thinking too, though, parents are not angels.
No.
You know, that's the thing. We're all
No.
human. Children are not angels and parents are not angels. So they also have conflicted motivations and parts of them that aren't pretty. You know, in their motivations towards all people, including towards their children.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, parents, for example, can be jealous of their children, to use a striking example.
Sure.
But or like we said the last time, they could derive an immediate sense of like triumph from putting a child in its place. Maybe not a long-term one, but an immediate sense of like satisfaction out of that, you know, just for the convenience aspect, if not for the cathartic, you know, feeling that, ooh,
Well,
it felt good.
I mean, and that example really sort of illustrates what Alice Miller was talking about, where the child may act out, and that creates anger in the parent, and they can then lash out at the child, meeting their own needs for not feeling helpless, all right, emotions that they've carried from their childhood.
And what you're saying, too, talks to the interpersonal aspect, again to the dynamic, how one thing leads to another, almost like a springboard and a series of forces of interplay within one's own psyche, and certainly what makes up even the own psyche ultimately is the interplay interpersonally, because humans are social animals.
Yeah, and what psychologists who work now, clinical psychologists who work in the sort of inner child model, sort of talk about that people sort of carry around with them these experiences, these painful, traumatic experiences from childhood, and that current experiences with other people, things they see on the media or something, will trigger them, will trigger that emotion, sort of activate that emotion that they're carrying around with them. And that becomes a sort of habitual pattern that people operate through adulthood on, unless they work to heal those wounds from childhood. Mm-hmm. And that's a big part of the process, the clinical process of therapy.
Back again to the idea that there's more than meets the eye, hence the notion of dynamicism, that it's a moving, living thing, and you used the word energy before, and you said energy to suppress or keep at bay, but how about energy to just that the system is energy, period, even the stuff that's coming out consciously or in the background and not causing difficulty, that we're a living thing, and that we are not automatonic machines that run on principles of that could be defined in strict mathematical logic, like 1 + 1 is 2. 1 + 1 could take us out to alphabet soup or something, because we have connectivity and associations and affect, which is the kind of emotional aura that we are either in or is connected with events and times and places. And that's a certain kind of reality that is very true, and that makes up our psychology, that makes up our inner psychology, that makes up our dynamic life, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Freud insisted upon, and it was a complete innovation at that time in the late 1800s, was if you want to know what a dream means, you need the dreamer in the room with you, and you need the dreamer's free associations. So at that time, actually in the late 1800s, you could go into a bookstore, any bookstore in Vienna or Central Europe, and buy these dream books, which were full of symbols. If you dream about a snake, you're going to have some angry encounter with someone. If you dream about a shovel, you're jealous. And this is completely arbitrary and considered to be universal for everyone. And they were popular. It was a kind of a fad. And Freud was very much against the idea that a symbol would stand for the same thing for everyone, for every human being. In his mind, the sort of rich, complex associations are individual. They're based on one person's experiences and impulses and how they've been transformed. So if you dream about a duck and I dream about a duck, could mean two completely different things. And the only way to know that is to try to unravel some of this complex set of associations that's individual to the person and not universal.
Back to that matter of the children playing with they were middle-aged children playing with the Barbie dolls, and father removing Ken or banning Ken. Would you like to make some sense out of that, Doctor? Would there some psychodynamic sense? Could you give us, and also what the kids did about it?
Well, kids spend a lot of time sort of acting out things they see in the adult world. All right, it's Sherry said, the little boy wear the tool belt and pretend he's a builder, that these childhood things have very important sort of symbolic meaning that they get to sort of represent and enact and pretend to be playing these adult roles. And Barbie lying on top of Ken was a way in which was a way of representing what they saw on TV all the time. When you watch the soap operas, you have couples lying in bed together all the time. It's become, unfortunately, widely pervasive. And so, this was an element of play that the children were
which is observational
enacting.
learning, really, more. This is not really a dynamic issue so much as just they see what they see, and then they enact it. They model their behavior.
Yes, although for this young woman as a child, it could really have some dynamic aspects as well, because clearly the father's reaction and issues of sexuality, I'm sure had come up. They had sort of picked up that they weren't going to learn anything about sexuality from their dad, and so they were. But still, it's very attractive. It's very interesting. There's something very compelling about it, and children conceive, and these people are doing something in bed there. What is that? Gee, let's sort of play around with that. And so, certainly, from the father's reaction, we can judge that he had a lot of, guilt and repression around issues of sexuality. And so...
Well, do you feel he should have allowed Ken to stay on top of Barbie or vice versa?
I think it would have been a good thing to do, to talk to his children about it. To say, gee, what are Ken and Barbie doing? All right? To sort of measure the depth of what the children are involved in, where they got these ideas, what they thought about it, what they felt about it.
Yeah.
That so many, and this has sort of come up in our research, that over half of our respondents said they learned nothing from their parents about sexuality. Only something like 7% of our sample had ever had a meaningful conversation about sexuality with their parents. And what parents need to do is to talk about issues of sexuality with their children, and it's even more important now than ever before because of the often distorted images of sexuality that are so widely pervasive in the mass media.
Would you say, to be crass, please forgive me, but would you say the guy was probably not the world's greatest lover? Would that be an hypothesis you might entertain? I mean, given his reaction, that he didn't have a easy attitude towards sex, and therefore, or would that be going too far?
Well, his reaction to me certainly seems as if he thought the solution to anything that might hurt or damage his daughters was to remove male figures. The Ken dolls got chucked. The Barbies got to stay. And of course the kids were resourceful enough to cut the hair short on one of the Barbies. But and so many fathers in adolescence who want to protect their daughters. And in our culture, given gender roles that we're used to, it's assumed that men are the sexual aggressors. And a lot of dads, I think, try to just, ban dating, keep the boys away, as a way of trying to keep their daughters safe.
Exactly. There's a sensibleness, too, but I guess the horror...
Well, but it's also, as you said, there's this interesting dynamic piece, I think, that not one word was spoken, according to this woman. Am I remembering that correctly?
There was
not
sort of like
one
that's
word
what she reported. Father didn't say anything.
It's one thing
not one word.
To cognitively just say, well, I think you're a little too young. We'll hold off on that for now. Neutral affect, this word affect. But to have this big affective response, right?
But even without a word, as you say, the father communicated what he was feeling, how much anxiety, which is probably related to what he had learned from his parents or what he had experienced growing up.
Or had not learned from his parents.
Yeah. And children are such canny creatures. All humans are really good at understanding nonverbal behavior. You know when someone's very anxious or very angry, even if they're not saying a word. And so unconsciously, those two little girls learned just like that, and very powerfully, sex is dangerous. There's something really dangerous about experimenting, being curious, and certainly never talk about it. And then later in that woman's life, those issues obviously came up.
So then this will be another pivot point, if you will, of the many, many pivot points in a personality, in a human psyche, that will be simultaneously occurrent, even if not in the conscious mind. And let's go even further, dynamically speaking. If this person had followed a tranche of subservience and dogmatic obeisance to the father figure, perhaps leading to a cold and distant attitude towards sex. But what if the dynamic between the two was more of a resistant one, where where she had other devious ideas to get around father, different personality complex, and maybe use this as a jumping off point to get even more involved, or so it gets very complicated. And like you say, it goes back to knowing the individual.
Yes.
To know the whole psychological terrain of the individual psyche and the dynamic of it. And I'd like to, and I also make a quick comment about. I would ask you, don't you think that there's sort of, in a way, a numbing down of neuroticism aspects of what develops in the inevitable conflicts and meanderings, and more of a psychopathology, like classic psychopathology, as one of the major disorders but in a sort of socio-cultural fashion, in as much as children no longer spend as much interactive time, have much more to do on their own, and go ahead and do what the parents don't. Many children are less coward. It's not a cowering time for a lot of children. Some are, but it's no longer the times of Austria. Today we've come a long way from that, and many children are openly defiant of their parents at very early ages, or the bonds are not the dynamics are not the same any longer of the classic ones. That's a very broad statement, but.
Well, certainly one of the problems, and it's a result of the sort of changing economic situation, where in the 1950s it was very rare for both parents to be working. Typically the husband was working and the wife was a homemaker raising the kids. Now just to have the same level, the same economic level as in the 1950s, both parents need to work, and that means that the parents are less available to children, and this has been the case. This has been a sort of a growing trend since the 1970s. And so you've had more and more kids having the experience of spending more and more time alone, as you say, unavailable, unable to be with their parents, not having a parental caretaker around. And so you have a lot of kids who have grown up without having a lot of their needs met. And if we want to think about the sort of pervasive problems, if we talk about Columbine and the various problems of violence, we have to do something on a societal level to have more parental figures, more adult figures involved in children's lives.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. But I also think to a large extent that there still is just widespread punitive attitudes towards children, so that even in daycare, even in school, there was a case in Boston not too long ago, or reported on the Boston News, of a situation in which a child had her mouth taped at school. And that's something that, in the 1940s, perhaps people wouldn't have thought a thing of it, but it's very damaging to children. Any sort of punitive interactions with children, and they do come from all over, from teachers, from caretakers. And it's interesting that I think it comes from the culture in some sense. Children are seeing the same kinds of movies. Maybe they're not watching Rambo, but they're seeing movies in which violence is present, whether it's cartoons on Saturday. And, you know, I think there's a way in which, too, as a culture, we encourage children, maybe not to be violent, certainly not towards us as parents or teachers, but to be tough. And that continues. That's a really central part of American
no doubt
culture.
about it. The ante is upped. What it is it's ratcheted up. The dynamic is changing, and we're at the end of time, but the dynamic is still there. I'm just saying the manifestations and mutations of it, I think, are changing. And this violent stuff, that is dynamic or otherwise, just feeding the kids, I mean, practically taking them by the hand, taking them to a closet and saying, here kids, mix these chemicals together, make a little bomb and go blow up that kid, and then look at the limbs over here and score 5 points. I mean, that's literally, this is what we're doing as a training ground. There's no excuse for that. I mean, that's beyond, you know, this thing that does violence or what they're seeing in these video games cause them to be violent when you're training them, pounding it into their heads, you know. But we're going to stop shortly, so I have a quick thing about sex. Sex. Sex makes the world go round. Money makes the world go round. Some people say you can make a good case that even money boils down to sex. Sex and money are the two main things. And that even money in the end can be shown to boil down to sex. But you know how much Freud talked about sex. People criticize him for it. And as we said before, it's broader than fornication. He meant much more by that. He meant the impulse of sexuality in humans to unite and be in connection to each other. But given this concept of sex and how much it's around, where would you put sex as in the scheme of importance and significance in human life, given that people will go to great lengths to find out about the sex life of people, to be peeping toms about it, to get magazines about it, to go to movies about it, to buy porno mags and stash them or watch them, or Pamela Lee and, you know, breast and these TV shows that show breasts now that are regular TV shows. And, you know, I mean, where do you think sex fits into the scheme of things, given all the evidence we see around us of how people feel about it, broadly speaking?
Well, I mean, obviously sexuality is a very important human sexual need that developed as an evolutionary mechanism for the perpetuation of the species, and so consequently significant neurophysiological changes occur when sexual arousal takes place, and with significant sort of various hormones like oxytocin and so on that are associated with important emotional experiences. So emotion gets linked in a very important way with sexuality as individuals from infancy on, because in fact oxytocin is released for mothers during nursing of their babies, which creates, helps with maternal-child bonding. So that sexuality is obviously a very important need, but it can, I think, really be twisted in some ways when people do not get their sort of early sexual needs for sort of sensuality and so on, skin touch and skin contact met.
Would you call it a need or a drive, in one word?
Oh, I'd call it a need.
You got the last word on it. Let me just I'd call it a drive. Go ahead.
I would call it one integral aspect of being human. I go with a vague answer.
Vague answer. Is it like at the root? Is it really fundamental?
It is, but it's not the only fundamental thing, and it's not the most fundamental. I think other things such as intimacy, there's a great saying, the most intimate thing that two people can do is talk. That is equally important to people. There would be a mistake to deny the importance of either, physical sexuality or emotional closeness, intellectual intimacy, spiritual connection, that they're all important and fundamental.
Yes. Last time we took our wrap-up message from Dr. Conrad, and we're going to take it again tonight from Dr. Conrad. The most intimate thing that people can do is talk to each other. And I want all the females out there who are being pressured to have sex and being taught, especially the teenagers, to remember that the most intimate thing they can do is talk. I see the camera person smiling. He's a male because he gets the picture. And so when you want to get really intimate with your boyfriend, you say, "No, honey, hold off. Let's talk." Okay? And, of course, that might cause frustration on the male side as those hormones rage. But remember, take it from Dr. Conrad, the most intimate thing you can do is talk. Talk sincerely and connect and relate. That's a very good, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a great thing to think about. Well, we're done on the show for this evening, and thanks for being with us, and we'll be back with you again. And thank you, Dr. Millburn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Conrad.
Thanks.
And good evening to you.
I was a stranger in the city, out of town were the people I knew. I had the feeling of self-pity. What to do, what to do, what to do. The outlook was decidedly blue. But as I walked through those foggy streets alone, it turned out to be the luckiest day I've known. A foggy day in London town had me low, had me down. I viewed the morning with alarm. The British Museum had lost its charm. How long, I wonder, could this thing last? But the age of miracles, no, hadn't passed. Suddenly I saw you there in a foggy London town. The sun was shining everywhere. A foggy day in London town had me low, had me down. I viewed the morning with alarm. The British Museum had lost its charm. How long, I wondered, could this thing last?